Grief has a strange way of silencing a room. That morning, as I stood at the back of St. Augustine's Church, the scent of lilies and old wood polish hanging heavy in the air, I couldn't hear a single word of the sermon. People were murmuring condolences, whispering about the will, even commenting on the flowers, but all I could hear was the faint echo of my grandmother's voice, her gentle tone reminding me that love outlasts everything, even death. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. But as I looked at the front pew where my parents sat, stiff, dry-eyed, and unbothered, it hit me that love was the one thing our family had already lost long before today. Hey everyone, welcome back to Revenge Classic. Thank you for being here, where true stories meet justice and every ending is earned. If you've ever had to fight quietly for your peace, this story will speak to you. Before we go further, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to join our growing family of listeners who believe in strength, dignity, and redemption. And to all our loyal subscribers, your comments, your support, your time, they mean more than you'll ever know. You make Revenge Classic what it is. My grandparents, Harold and Grace Whitmore, have been everything my parents weren't: gentle, patient, and full of quiet integrity. When my parents were too busy building their careers to remember birthdays or school events, it was my grandparents who stepped in. They raised me through the cracks of other people's ambition. They taught me that decency matters more than status, that keeping your word is more valuable than keeping appearances. Losing them both within a single week felt like losing the ground beneath my feet. But the part that hurt most wasn't their absence. It was knowing the only people left to call family were the ones who'd never truly acted like it. After the service, I stayed behind while everyone else filed out into the gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like it hadn't finished grieving. I was staring at the closed casket when I heard a voice behind me. "Ethan," said Mr. Fallon, my grandparents' attorney, placing a hand on my shoulder. His tone was gentle but firm. "They left instructions that you attend the will reading today. It's important." I nodded slowly, trying to steady my breathing. My parents, who were near the entrance, turned sharply when they heard my name. My father's expression tightened. My mother's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering beneath her carefully applied sadness. That was the first sign something was coming, something they weren't expecting to lose. 2 hours later, I found myself sitting in the conference room of Fallon and Finch Legal Group, a place that smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. The table was long, the atmosphere tense. My parents sat across from me like statues carved from ego and entitlement. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace. My father clasped his hands together, his jaw set. My brother, Adam, was late, as usual. When he finally walked in, the air around him carried the faint trace of whiskey. He didn't even bother to apologize. Mr. Fallon cleared his throat and opened a sealed envelope. "Harold and Grace Whitmore," he began, "prepared a joint will 3 months before their passing. It includes the distribution of their assets, estate, and trust funds." My father leaned forward, his tone clipped but eager. "Let's get on with it then," he said. "We'll handle the property divisions and trusts accordingly." Mr. Fallon raised a hand. "Please allow me to read it in full." He adjusted his glasses and continued. "To our son, Charles Whitmore, and his wife, Patricia, we leave the sum of $1 each. This is not out of neglect, but acknowledgement. Over the years, we provided financial assistance far beyond measure, and what remains must now serve a different purpose." The words fell into the room like a bomb. My mother's face went pale. My father's grip on the armrest tightened, the veins in his hand standing out. $1, he said slowly, his voice shaking with disbelief. Mr. Fallon didn't flinch. "To our grandson, Ethan Whitmore, we leave the remainder of our estate, valued at approximately $12 million, including the Whitmore family home, all trusts, investments, and personal property therein." I froze. I had no idea what to say. The only sound in the room was my father's ragged breathing. My mother's shock turned to outrage, her voice sharp and trembling. "That can't be right. They would never cut us out like that. There must be another version of the will. There isn't, Mr. Fallon replied calmly. This is the only version signed and recorded by both parties. They also left a video statement confirming their intent. My father slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. He's 30 years old, and they're leaving him everything? This isn't how family works. Mr. Fallon looked at him steadily. Sir, this is how your parents wished it to work. My mother turned toward me, her voice trembling with anger. What did you say to them, Ethan? What did you do to make them change their minds? I swallowed hard. Nothing. I didn't even know. She laughed bitterly. Don't lie to me. You've always been their favorite, their little project. Well, congratulations. You've finally taken everything. The words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to defend myself, but what could I say? That I didn't ask for this? That I would trade every dollar for one more dinner with them? I knew it wouldn't matter. When the reading ended, my parents stormed out. My brother stayed long enough to mutter, "You're in for it," before following them. Mr. Fallon placed a sealed envelope in front of me. They left you a personal letter, he said softly. Open it when you're ready. And Ethan, your grandparents were wise people. They anticipated this reaction. They asked that you move into the estate immediately. Their final note said, and I quote, "Make it your home before they try to make it theirs." I left the office with the envelope tucked safely in my coat pocket. As I drove to the Whitmore estate, the road stretched endlessly before me, lined with bare trees and fading sunlight. When the mansion came into view, I felt my throat tighten. It was beautiful and haunting all at once. The house where I'd learned to bake cookies with Grandma Grace, where Grandpa Harold taught me chess, where laughter once echoed like music. I stepped inside quietly. The air smelled like cedar and dust, but beneath that was something familiar, comfort. I placed my bag down and walked through the living room, where their portraits hung side by side above the fireplace. Their eyes seemed to follow me, kind and knowing, as if they were still watching over me. That night, I sat at the dining table under the chandelier's warm glow, the envelope before me. I turned it over in my hands before carefully breaking the wax seal. Inside was my grandmother's handwriting, elegant, gentle, unmistakable. Our dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, it means we are gone. You have always been our pride, not for what you have, but for who you are. The others will not understand. They will come to take, not to give. Remember this. Money reveals hearts faster than years ever could. Protect what we've built, but more importantly, protect your peace. You are not alone. I stared at the last line for a long time. You're not alone. The words echoed through the empty halls. I didn't know what she meant then, but I would soon. That letter wasn't just love, it was warning. Because before the week was over, my parents would prove her right. And that was the day I learned the real fight over inheritance had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house felt louder than usual, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets I wasn't yet meant to hear. My grandparents' letter lay open beside the lamp on the nightstand, its edges slightly curled under the faint warmth of the bulb. I must have read it a dozen times, tracing the words with my fingers until I could hear my grandmother's voice saying them in my head. You are not alone. I didn't know what she meant, but as the hours passed, I started to understand that sometimes warnings come disguised as comfort. The next morning, the storm arrived. Not from the sky, but from my parents. It started with a phone call just after sunrise. I remember the exact sound of it, the shrill, impatient ring cutting through the stillness of the house. I answered on the second ring. My father's voice was already raised before I could even say hello. Ethan, this isn't going to stand, he snapped. We need to meet today. I don't care where you are. You're going to come here, and we're going to fix this mess. His tone was the same one he used when I was a kid, and he wanted to remind me who held the power. Dad, I said slowly, there's nothing to fix. The will is clear. You heard it. He scoffed. Clear? You think this is fair? You think after everything your mother and I did for this family, your grandparents had the right to humiliate us like that? They weren't in their right minds, Ethan. They were manipulated by you. My jaw tightened. That's not true. You expect me to believe, he continued, voice rising, that two people in their late 70s suddenly decide to cut out their only son and leave everything to a spoiled, soft-handed grandson who's done nothing for them except visit twice a month. That last line stung because it wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Truth didn't have a place in his version of the story. I stayed quiet, and that seemed to enrage him even more. You think you can hide behind that lawyer? He said. You think a piece of paper changes who built this family? You owe us that inheritance, Ethan. Every cent of it. The words "owe us" rang in my ears long after he hung up. I stared at the phone for a long while, then placed it face down on the counter. My hands were shaking, but my chest felt oddly steady. My father wasn't new to emotional warfare. He'd been practicing it his entire life. By noon, I received a string of messages from my mother, each one shorter and colder than the last. You've embarrassed us. This isn't what your grandparents wanted. You'll regret this, Ethan. Don't make us your enemies. I didn't reply to any of them. That evening, I went to the study, the heart of the Whitmore estate. It was exactly as I remembered. The dark oak shelves, the smell of tobacco and leather, the faint scratch marks on the floor where Grandpa Harold used to push his chair back. I sat at his old desk, running my hand across its surface. For a moment, I could almost see him there, smiling, reminding me to keep a clear head when others lose theirs. That was when the headlights appeared outside. Two sharp beams cutting through the dusk, sweeping across the lawn like searchlights. My stomach tightened. I already knew who it was before I even heard the car door slam. My parents hadn't even called first. They marched up the porch steps like they owned the place. I opened the door before they could start banging. My mother's expression was all polite fury, smiling lips, angry eyes. My father's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "Can we come in?" my mother asked sweetly. I stepped aside without answering. They didn't wait for an invitation. My father immediately started pacing, scanning the house with the kind of nostalgia that felt like ownership. My mother looked around too, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, I must say, it's generous of you to let us see our family home again." "It's still the family home," I said carefully. "You're welcome here any time, but you can't treat it like—" "Like what?" she cut in sharply. "Like ours." I met her eyes. "Like it's a prize." That hit something. Her face tightened, and my father turned toward me, stepping closer. "You're being arrogant, son," he said. "You don't understand how things work. This isn't about greed, it's about legacy. That money, that property, it represents generations of Whitmores. And it belongs to the family, not just you." I crossed my arms. "Then why did they leave it to me?" He froze for half a second before scoffing. "Because they were manipulated. Probably thought they were doing the right thing, making you feel important. But you know better now, don't you?" I held his gaze. "What I know," I said quietly, "is that they made their choice with clear minds, and I intend to honor it." My mother let out a bitter laugh. "Honor it? By sitting here alone in this house, pretending you're some kind of heir to a dynasty? Grow up, Ethan. You think this money makes you safe? You have no idea what it means to handle responsibility." My father cut in, his tone low, measured, but full of warning. "You can make this easy or difficult, son. We don't want to fight, but we're not walking away empty-handed. You owe us something." There was again. "Oh, I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Not this time." For a moment, no one spoke. My father's face flushed red. My mother's eyes glistened, not with tears, but anger disguised as heartbreak. Finally, my father pointed a trembling hand at me. "You'll regret this," he said. "Don't think for a second we'll sit back while you destroy everything we've built." Then they left. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house long after their car pulled away. I stood in the foyer, staring at the staircase, the chandelier above it flickering faintly in the draft. My pulse was steady, but my mind was racing. They wouldn't give up. Not like that. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and tried to calm the storm inside my chest. But even as I drank, I caught sight of something on the counter, a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. My hands went cold as I opened it. It was a note written in my mother's handwriting. If you think this house will protect you, remember who taught you where the keys are. I set the paper down slowly, my mind spinning. She'd been in the study. She'd touched things. And just like that, my grandmother's warning made perfect sense. You're not alone. They weren't just angry. They were preparing to take something back. And the worst part was, I didn't yet know how far they were willing to go. The next morning, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It was the same creaking wood, the same faint smell of cedar and tea leaves my grandmother loved. But something about it had changed overnight. Every echo of my footsteps seemed to follow me too closely. Every corner of the house felt like it was holding its breath. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or instinct, but when family turns on you, you start questioning even the air you breathe. I didn't tell anyone about the note. I folded it, placed it in a small box, and locked it away in my grandparents' old study. It wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder of who I was dealing with. My parents had always been manipulative, but now that $12 million was at stake, I knew they'd stopped thinking of me as their son. I was a roadblock, and they had never been the kind to avoid confrontation when something stood in their way. That day, I began exploring the estate room by room. The place was too large for one person, a mix of beauty and melancholy frozen in time. My grandparents' bedroom was untouched, the bed perfectly made, my grandmother's jewelry neatly displayed, and her favorite wool shawl still folded across the chair. On the desk beside it sat a half-finished crossword puzzle. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering what word she'd been searching for when time ran out. In the hallway hung portraits of ancestors I barely knew, men in sharp suits, women in lace collars, all staring out as if judging how well I'd carry the Whitmore name. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me. As a child, I'd found comfort in those faces. As an adult, they made me uneasy. I understood now that heritage was not the same as family. Blood can bind you, but it can also curse you. In the study, I decided to secure everything important. I went through my grandfather's cabinets, locking away documents, bank statements, and property deeds. Among the folders, I found a small brass key taped under one drawer. It didn't belong to any of the locks I'd seen. For some reason, my pulse quickened as I held it. The tag tied to it had a single word written in my grandfather's handwriting: basement. The basement had always been off limits when I was younger. My grandparents kept it locked, saying it was where old things go to rest. That day, I decided to see what that really meant. The door was tucked away behind the kitchen pantry, hidden by a shelf of dusty cookbooks. When I unlocked it, the hinges groaned like they were waking from a long sleep. The air that greeted me was cold, carrying the smell of concrete and age. I descended slowly, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement wasn't like the rest of the house. It was utilitarian, almost secretive. There were rows of old chests, boxes labeled in my grandfather's handwriting, and an antique safe built into the wall. On one table sat an old typewriter, a stack of letters beside it sealed in wax. I brushed off the dust and picked one up. The first envelope was addressed to me. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably my grandmother's. I tore it open carefully. Ethan, if you found this, then you've stepped into a room built for truth, not comfort. Your grandfather and I kept this space private because what's kept here isn't for the world, it's for protection. Inside the safe, you'll find documents that explain everything. Not just about the inheritance, but about the family you come from. Trust no one who asks for what they did not earn. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the safe. The key from the desk fit perfectly. Inside were 3 folders bound in leather and a small wooden box. The first folder contained the estate's deeds and trust transfers, all legitimate and watertight. The second held letters between my grandparents and their attorney detailing their decision to exclude my parents. But the third folder, that one stopped me cold. It was filled with proof of my father's debts, unpaid loans, lawsuits, even evidence of stolen funds from my grandparents' accounts. money he had siphoned off slowly over years while pretending to manage their finances. My grandparents had known all along. They hadn't disinherited him out of favoritism toward me. They'd done it out of necessity, to protect what little integrity the family name had left. I sat on the cold floor, the papers spread out before me, the truth heavy in my hands. Every memory of my father's anger, every bitter word, every cruel lesson about earning my place suddenly made sense. He wasn't angry that I'd been chosen. He was angry that he'd been caught. I placed everything back carefully, locking the safe and pocketing the key. As I turned to leave, I heard something faint, a creak above me, followed by a soft thud. My breath caught. The sound came from the kitchen, right above the basement door. I turned off my flashlight and waited, listening. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. Then, gathering my nerve, I climbed the stairs quietly. When I reached the top, I found the kitchen lights still off, but the back door, which I had locked earlier, was slightly open. A cold draft swept through the room. I stepped closer, my heartbeat loud in my ears. On the counter lay a coffee mug, still warm. I hadn't made coffee that morning. I stepped outside, scanning the yard. Nothing. No car, no figures, just the sound of wind through the maple trees. Whoever had been here was gone, or hiding. I shut the door, locked it, and turned the deadbolt twice. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was realization. My mother's note hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. They were going to take what they wanted, one way or another. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep upstairs. I stayed in the study, the safe key tucked into my pocket, a flashlight within reach. Every noise made me sit up straight. Somewhere around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally won. I fell asleep at my grandfather's desk, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's past. When I woke up, sunlight poured through the window, and for a brief second, I almost forgot where I was. Then I noticed the letter lying on the floor, the one from the basement, the one my grandmother had written. Someone had moved it, and scrawled in red ink across the bottom, in handwriting that wasn't hers, were 3 new words. We warned you. My blood ran cold. They weren't bluffing anymore. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows, but it didn't feel like light anymore. It felt like exposure. Every golden beam seemed to find the shadows where my trust used to live and burn them away. I sat at my grandparents' study desk, the red ink message spread out in front of me, the words "we warned you" still drying on the page. My hands were cold, even though the house was warm. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the sharp, hollow awareness that I was no longer dealing with anger or entitlement. I was dealing with something darker. The first thing I did was check the locks. Every door, every window, every latch. I replaced the screws in the basement hinge, bolted the back door, and pushed a chair under the front handle. It felt absurd, fortifying a mansion like a panicked tenant, but there was no other word for what I was now. Unwelcome. I had inherited wealth, yes, but I had also inherited war. After securing the house, I called Mr. Fallon, the lawyer who had read the will. His voice was steady as ever, but there was an edge to it now, like he'd expected this. "Ethan," he said, "listen carefully. I'm aware of the threats your parents might make. Harold and Grace warned me this could happen. You need to document everything. Keep every message, record every visit, and if they show up again, call me before you open the door." I hesitated. "You think they'd actually—" "I think," he interrupted gently, "you'd be surprised what money does to people who've already lost their morals." I thanked him and hung up, staring at the empty phone screen. That sentence clung to me for hours. What money does to people who've already lost their morals. It echoed louder than my father's threats or my mother's feigned heartbreak. That afternoon, I decided to leave the house, partly to clear my mind, partly to make sure I wasn't turning paranoid. I drove into town, a small community that sat like a painting against the valley hills. People there remembered my grandparents well. They greeted me with kind smiles and condolences. One older man, Mr. Langston, waved me down near the old general store. He'd been the caretaker of the estate years ago. "I heard about your folks passing," he said, his weathered face softening. "They were good people. Real ones." "They were," I said quietly. "Better than I probably deserved." He chuckled. "Nonsense. You were always the one who'd stop to help your grandma with those rose bushes. The others just wanted to pose by them." Then his tone grew serious. "How are things with your father?" The question made me pause. Complicated, I admitted. Figured as much. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Your granddad once told me he worried about that man. Said greed was a disease, and your father caught it young." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like confirmation. When I got back to the house, evening had settled in, and the air outside was sharp with the smell of rain. I stepped inside quietly, expecting the same emptiness, but something felt off. There was a faint hum, the sound of the refrigerator door slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. I walked to the kitchen slowly, every step measured. The door wasn't wide open, just cracked enough to let the motor strain. Someone had been here again. This time, they'd taken nothing, but they'd left a sign. A single silver spoon, my grandmother's, resting perfectly on the counter. That spoon had always been her favorite, engraved with her initials. I'd left it locked in the china cabinet upstairs. I didn't panic. I didn't call the police. Instead, I went to the study, turned on the lamp, and began my own form of preparation. My grandfather's safe held more than documents. It held leverage. Inside, I found bank records, letters, and statements that traced exactly where money had disappeared over the last 10 years. My father had borrowed hundreds of thousands from the family trust, all for business, with none of it repaid. I gathered copies of everything. My grandparents hadn't left me defenseless. They'd left me armed with truth. For the next few days, I made the estate my fortress. The landscapers stopped coming. I sent them their pay and asked them not to return for a while. I changed the locks and set up motion lights outside. It wasn't about paranoia anymore. It was about drawing a line between what was mine and what would never belong to them again. Then, on the third night, the line was tested. I was sitting in the living room, reading through one of my grandfather's journals, when I heard the crunch of gravel outside. My chest tightened. I turned off the lamp and peeked through the curtains. Headlights. A car idling at the edge of the driveway. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the engine cut off. The car door opened. I caught a glimpse of movement. A silhouette near the gate. I couldn't see the face, but I didn't need to. The stance, the posture, the slow, deliberate way they walked. It was my father. He didn't come to the door this time. He just stood by the gate, staring at the house, smoking. When he finally left, he flicked the cigarette onto the driveway and drove off into the dark. The next morning, I found the burnt end of the cigarette, but pressed into an envelope near the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You can hide behind lawyers all you want, but you can't rewrite blood. This family built you, and we'll take back what's ours." No signature, no name. Just the same red ink as before. That was the breaking point. I called Mr. Fallon and told him everything. Within hours, he arranged a security team to monitor the estate discreetly. "Ethan," he said, "this isn't just intimidation anymore. They're escalating. But remember what your grandparents wanted. They didn't give you this inheritance for revenge. They gave it to you for restoration, to rebuild what they spent their lives protecting." After the call, I sat by the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. I realized something then, something my grandparents must have known all along. The real danger wasn't in losing the money. It was in letting it change who I was. My father wanted chaos. My mother wanted guilt. Both wanted control, but I wouldn't give them either. That night, I opened my grandmother's letter again and underlined one line with a steady hand: "Protect your peace." From that moment, every move I made would be measured, deliberate, and lawful. I would not fight like them. I would fight smarter. I didn't know it then, but that choice, that decision to hold my ground with quiet strength, would lead to a confrontation far more public, far more destructive, and far more final than any of us expected. Because while they were plotting to take back the estate, I was already preparing to expose the truth they'd spent decades burying. It happened faster than I expected. When people lose access to power, they tend to respond in one of two ways. They shrink back, or they explode. My parents had never been the shrinking type. They struck the way they always had, quietly at first, then all at once. The first sign was subtle. My debit card declined at a coffee shop in town. I thought it was a banking error until I checked my account balance later that day. Every personal account that shared my father's name as a co-signer from my college years had been frozen. Not emptied, just frozen, suspended under the excuse of ownership dispute. I tried calling the bank, but the manager's tone told me everything. "Your father came by yesterday," she said carefully, "and raised some concerns about recent transactions. We'll need legal clarification before restoring access." Legal clarification. Two words that can drain a man's calm faster than a threat ever could. I called Mr. Fallon, and he promised to send over the estate's proof of independence. But I could hear it in his voice. He was worried. "They're building a case," he said. "False claims, emotional manipulation, anything to paint you as unfit to handle the inheritance. Don't react publicly. Stay quiet. Let me handle it." I agreed, but silence was a hard thing to keep when you could feel the world closing in. By the next week, I'd received 3 letters from creditors I didn't recognize, claiming I owed balances from companies I'd never heard of. When I called to dispute them, each account traced back to an old joint address, my parents' home. They were trying to rewrite my life on paper. The final blow came on a Wednesday morning. I drove into the city to check my apartment, the one I'd been keeping as a backup ever since I moved into the estate. The door lock had been changed. I stood there in the hallway with the lease still in my hand, reading the notice taped to the door: "Tenant removed, property owner request." My father had been the guarantor on the lease from years back. He'd used that loophole to evict me. I laughed at the irony. Homeless by the hands of a man furious that I'd inherited a home. I didn't tell anyone. I simply got back in my car, drove 2 hours through the drizzle, and returned to the only place I had left, the Whitmore estate. As the gates closed behind me, a strange calm settled over me. I realized I had nothing left to lose that could be taken. They had stripped away convenience, not security. I still had the house, the proof, and something far more valuable, the truth. That night, I made tea and sat in the library surrounded by portraits of long-gone Whitmores who had known their share of family wars. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the air. "When they push you out, build your foundation higher." So that's what I did. The next morning, I met again with Mr. Fallon. He had already filed injunctions to protect the estate's assets. "They've contacted the probate court," he said. "They're claiming undue influence, that you manipulated your grandparents during their final months." I shook my head slowly, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "They weren't there. I was." "I know," he replied. "And so do your grandparents. That's why they left safeguards." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were notarized statements from my grandparents' doctors and caregivers confirming their mental soundness when a will was written. There was even a short video testimony of my grandmother speaking directly to the camera, her voice clear and steady. "If you're watching this," she said, "it means our son has challenged the will. Charles, we love you, but love doesn't erase betrayal. Ethan stood by us when you did not. Let this stand." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Seeing her face again broke something open in me. Grief, relief, maybe both. Mr. Fallon rested a hand on the folder. "We'll use this if they proceed. It's airtight." That evening, I returned to the estate with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was going to defend, quietly but completely. I called in a security company recommended by Fallon to install cameras and alarms. The lead technician, a calm man named Reese, set up the system over 2 days. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "You're not the first person to fight family over money, but you're the first I've seen doing it with this kind of restraint. Keep it that way. Anger's what they want." His words echoed later that night, when headlights flashed through the front window again. Same car, same rhythm of engine idling. My parents. I didn't go outside this time. I'll let the cameras record. They stayed 10 minutes talking near the gate, then drove away. The next morning, Fallon called. They've escalated, he said. Your father filed for an emergency hearing. They're claiming you're mentally unfit to manage large assets and requesting court oversight. I let out a breath and leaned back in the chair. Of course they did. He hesitated before adding, we'll fight it. But Ethan, it might get ugly. I almost smiled. It already is. Over the next week, I built my defense like a man preparing for siege. I cataloged every letter, recorded every voicemail, even photographed the red ink threats. The evidence grew, neat and organized like the map of a battlefield. The truth was on my side, but the weight of it was heavy. There were nights I would stand at the window of the estate, looking out across the lawn, and wonder if this was what my grandparents had foreseen. Maybe they had understood that inheritance isn't measured in wealth, it's measured in resilience. Then, one morning, I received a knock at the door. A courier handed me an envelope-stamped notice of hearing. Family probate court. The date was set for 2 weeks later. My parents had forced the confrontation. I didn't open the rest of my mail that day. I didn't need to. The battle wasn't about to begin. It had already started. That night, I walked the halls of the house slowly, running my hand along the walls as though reassuring the place itself that I wouldn't let it fall. I stopped at the portraits of my grandparents, their eyes calm and steady in the flickering light. You trusted me with everything, I whispered. I won't let you down. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. The rain began again, gentle at first, then fierce, hammering the roof like an omen. I stood there listening until my fear turned into something sharper, resolve. They had taken my accounts, my apartment, and my peace. But they hadn't taken my truth. And in 2 weeks, I'd make sure the world saw it for what it was. 2 days after the notice arrived, I drove into town under a low, gray sky that looked ready to crack open with rain. My mind was crowded, filled with too many thoughts and too little peace. I hadn't left the estate much since the day I discovered the letter in red ink, but the walls of the house were starting to feel heavy, like they'd absorbed too much of my tension. I needed air, and more than that, I needed answers. I found Mr. Langston where he always seemed to be, sitting outside the general store with a cup of black coffee and a newspaper folded neatly beside him. The man had aged since my childhood, his beard more silver than gray, his hands spotted and scarred from years of labor. But his eyes, those calm, clear eyes, were still the same. They held that quiet kind of wisdom that comes from watching life unfold without interfering in it. He looked up as I parked. You look like you've been chewing on thunder, boy, he said, smiling faintly. I managed a small laugh. Feels about right. He nodded toward the chair beside him. Seat. Tell me what's chasing you. I took a seat, resting my elbows on my knees. You remember my father. Hard to forget, he said dryly. I told him everything. The frozen accounts, the eviction, the court hearing. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. Your grandparents weren't wrong about him, he said. Charles was always hungry for more. Never enough for him that his parents gave him a business start, a good name, and a reputation to stand on. He wanted the throne and the crown both. I sighed. They left everything to me, Langston, and it's tearing what's left of this family apart. He tilted his head, studying me. It's not the inheritance doing the tearing, son. It's what it's revealing. That line landed in me like truth always does, quietly, deeply, undeniably. He leaned back in his chair. Your grandparents knew this day would come. That's why your grandfather called me 6 months before he passed. Told me he was setting things in motion that would make some people very angry, and that if trouble came knocking, I was to remind you of something. I frowned. Remind me of what? Langston smiled slightly. He said, tell the boy there's strength in the soil. I blinked. The soil. He nodded toward the direction of the estate. He meant that house, that land, that name. The estate wasn't just a building. It was built with purpose. Every decision Harold made, every investment, every ledger, there's a trail of honesty buried in that soil. If your father tries to twist the story, that truth will anchor you. I sat back, letting his words sink in. He really thought of everything, didn't he? Langston's gaze softened. He did. And so did your grandmother. She came to see me a few weeks before they passed. Left something with me. Said it might be useful one day. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key on a ribbon. Said it opened the drawer to Harold's personal desk at the bank. She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right. I stared at the key. Why not just include it in the will? Because, he said, handing it to me, some things don't belong in paper battles. They belong in a man's hands. That afternoon, I went straight to the bank. The clerk recognized the Whitmore name immediately and guided me to a private room. When she returned, she carried a single wooden drawer box labeled Personal, H. Whitmore. Inside was a sealed envelope, an old photograph, and a USB flash drive. The photograph stopped me cold. It was of my grandparents, younger, standing in front of the estate with my father. He must have been around my age then. His arm was draped over my grandmother's shoulder, his smile wide, confident, and full of deceit I was too young to recognize. On the back, my grandfather had written, "Before the rot." I swallowed hard and opened the envelope. It contained a notarized affidavit, signed by both of them, detailing every financial transaction my father had taken from their accounts. They had documented it all, down to the cent. The USB drive held video evidence, my father's voice, his promises to pay it back soon, his admission that no one would ever find out. By the time I drove home, my anger had cooled into something sharper, clarity. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was an unveiling. That night, I sat in the study, the same place where I'd found the first letter, and spread everything out across the desk. The letters, the affidavits, the video files, the security recordings of their visits, even the threats written in red ink. It was all there, forming a story that was finally undeniable. And that was when the phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Ethan," came my mother's voice, soft and tired. "Please don't hang up." I didn't respond. "Your father, he's not well," she said. "This is destroying him. You've proven your point. You got what you wanted. Can't we just end this before it gets worse?" Her tone was a performance, rehearsed and polished. It had worked when I was a boy, when I still believed her tears meant remorse. But now, every word felt like the same trap wrapped in pity. "It's already worse," I said quietly. "You just don't like the view from the other side." There was silence. Then her voice hardened. "You think you've won because of a signature? You don't know your father like I do. He doesn't lose. I guess we'll see," I replied, and hung up. That night, I went to bed with a strange comfort of purpose. For months, I had been reacting, defending, dodging, surviving. But now I was prepared. I wasn't just inheriting wealth. I was inheriting a war my grandparents had already mapped out for me to win. 2 days later, Mr. Fallon and I met to organize the evidence. "They won't see this coming," he said as he copied the files on his laptop. "By the time they set foot in that courtroom, they'll have nowhere to stand." I looked out the office window, watching the rain fall against the city glass. "Good," I said quietly, "because I'm done running from ghosts." Fallon nodded once, slipping the folder back into his case. "Then let's bury them." And as I drove back to the estate that evening, headlights cutting through the fog, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Calm. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for peace and start creating it yourself. But as I turned into the long driveway, I noticed something strange. 2 faint sets of tire tracks in the mud, still wet, leading up to the house. The alarm lights blinked softly from the gate, steady and green. Everything seemed untouched. And yet the front door was open. The front door creaked softly as I pushed it open, the faint smell of rain-soaked air drifting through the hallway. My instinct screamed before my logic caught up. Someone had been here. Again, I froze at the threshold, scanning the room without stepping inside. The carpets were undisturbed, the lamps still in place, but the smallest details betrayed the truth. The grandfather clock by the staircase had stopped at 3:12 a.m. The study door was half open, and on the marble floor, just inside the entryway, a muddy footprint pointed toward the living room. I didn't call the police right away. I knew who it was. My parents had stopped pretending to fight fair the day they lost the will. They were hunting for something now, proof, leverage, anything they could twist before the hearing. I moved quietly from room to room, checking drawers, shelves, and locks. Nothing obvious was missing, but in the study, the safe door hung ajar. My stomach dropped. I pulled it open and stared inside. The files and letters were still there, thank God, but the small wooden box that had contained my grandparents' letter, the first one I'd ever read, was gone. That wasn't theft. That was a message. That night, I called Mr. Fallon. They broke in, I said flatly. They didn't take money. They took her letter. He was silent for a long time. They're panicking, he said finally. Desperate people make dangerous moves. I'll inform the judge first thing in the morning. This will strengthen your case. The words your case echoed in my mind long after we hung up. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a war of truth, and the battleground was about to shift into a courtroom. The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning where the world feels half awake. I wore my grandfather's Navy suit, the one he'd worn at every business deal that required dignity over dominance. Mr. Fallon met me outside the courthouse with his briefcase in hand. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for months," I said. Inside, the courtroom was small but suffocatingly formal. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm tone, presided over the room like someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. My parents sat across from me with their attorney, a man named Harris, slick and smug, who greeted me with a smile that felt like a warning. My mother's eyes met mine briefly before she looked away. My father didn't look at me at all. The proceedings began with Harris standing to make his case. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here because my clients, Charles and Patricia Whitmore, have reason to believe that their late parents was written under undue influence and emotional manipulation by their grandson, Ethan. The evidence suggests that Harold and Grace Whitmore, in their advanced age, were not of sound mind when they altered the distribution of their assets. It was rehearsed, perfectly delivered, and disgustingly familiar. My father's face stayed stoic, but I could see his hand gripping the table. He wasn't as calm as he wanted the room to believe. Then it was Fallon's turn. He rose slowly, straightening his jacket. "Your Honor, we will present evidence to the contrary. In fact, we have documentation, testimony, and video proof that not only confirms Harold and Grace Whitmore's mental soundness, but also reveals years of financial exploitation at the hands of their son, Mr. Whitmore Sr. The air in the room shifted. Harris's smirk faltered. My mother's hand tightened around her purse. Fallon continued. The deceased were deliberate in their actions. They did not act out of confusion or favoritism, but out of necessity, to preserve their family's legacy from the very people who sought to destroy it. The judge leaned back. "Proceed." Fallon motioned to the clerk, who dimmed the lights as a small monitor flickered to life. He pressed play. There they were, my grandparents. My grandmother in her soft blue sweater, my grandfather sitting beside her with that same quiet authority that used to fill the house. "If you're watching this," my grandmother said gently, "it means our son has challenged our wishes. We made this decision together, in clear mind and full heart. We love our family, but love must not blind truth. Ethan has stood by us with respect, not greed. We leave him what remains of our life's work because he will protect it, not exploit it." My grandfather spoke next, his voice calm but resolute. "Charles, if you're listening, this is not revenge. It's consequence. You've taken enough from this family. Let this end with us." The room was silent when the video ended. My parents' attorney shifted uncomfortably. My mother dabbed her eyes, whispering something to my father, but he sat rigid, his jaw locked. Fallon handed the judge another file. "In addition to the video testimony, we have signed medical evaluations confirming mental soundness, notarized affidavits detailing prior theft, and bank records, dated, authenticated, and traceable, to accounts under Charles Whitmore's management. The judge flipped through the documents slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at my father. "Mr. Whitmore, would you like to respond to these allegations?" For the first time since the proceedings began, my father spoke. His voice cracked slightly under strain. "This is a lie," he said. "My parents didn't understand business. They gave too much power to lawyers who twisted their intentions. They were manipulated by him." He pointed at me like I was a stranger, his voice rising. "He poisoned them against us." I met his gaze, calm, unflinching. "No, Dad, you did that yourself." A hush fell over the room. The judge's gavel tapped lightly. "That's enough," she said firmly. "This court recognizes the validity of the will as written and denies the petition for undue influence. The estate remains under the sole management of Mr. Ethan Whitmore." My father's face drained of color. My mother covered her mouth, eyes wide. Harris leaned in to whisper something, but my father waved him off, muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." But it was, at least legally. The bailiff called for adjournment. I stood, shaking Fallon's hand. He gave me a small, approving nod. "They'll stew," he said quietly. "But you held the high ground. That's what your grandparents would have wanted." Outside the courthouse, the air felt clearer, the storm finally breaking. Reporters weren't there, no cameras, no chaos. Just me standing alone on the courthouse steps, breathing in freedom that didn't feel like victory, but something better, peace. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a single white envelope wedged under the wiper. No address, no stamp, just my name. I opened it. Inside was my grandmother's handwriting, delicate, looping, unmistakably hers. "Ethan, if this reaches you after the trial, then you've done what we knew you would, stand with dignity. You've defended not just our estate, but our honor. Now use it well. What we built was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to help." At the bottom of the letter was an address and a short note. "Go there when you're ready." I folded the letter and looked toward the sky. The clouds were breaking apart, letting streaks of light pour through like a promise. I didn't know where that address would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't walking alone. The war was over, but the legacy that was just beginning. The address my grandmother had left was written in her signature looping cursive. The ink slightly faded, as if it had been waiting years to be read. I must have stared at it for a full minute before folding the letter and sliding it into my jacket pocket. There was no city name, just a street number and a rural route about 40 miles outside town. I didn't recognize it, but somehow I knew it mattered. The drive out there was quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. The sky was clearing after the storm, streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds like golden veins. The roads turned narrower the farther I went, the asphalt giving way to gravel, then to dirt, and then finally to a long, winding lane lined with tall oaks. When I reached the end, I stopped the car and just sat there, looking at what stood before me. It wasn't a mansion, not even a large estate. It was an old farmhouse, sturdy, whitewashed, and surrounded by wide, open land. The sign by the gate read Grace Haven. The name hit me immediately. My grandmother's name was Grace. I stepped out and walked up the path, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. The house looked well cared for, but lived in, with flowers along the porch and a faint scent of lavender in the air. On the front door was a small brass plaque engraved with a Whitmore family crest. Beneath it were 4 words, "A gift meant forward." When I knocked, the door opened almost instantly. A woman in her late 50s stood there, her hair streaked with gray, her face kind but cautious. "You must be Ethan," she said, her tone warm but deliberate. "They told me you'd come one day." I frowned. "Who did?" She smiled gently. "Your grandparents." The woman's name was Clara, and she led me inside to a small sitting room where sunlight spilled across shelves filled with books and photographs. "Grace Haven isn't a home," she said. "It's a refuge. Your grandparents started it 20 years ago, quietly without attention. It's a trust-funded sanctuary for families who lost everything but their hope. They never wanted anyone to know where it came from. I looked around, stunned. On the walls were photos of families, smiling children, parents rebuilding, people holding keys to new homes. Some pictures had plaques beneath them. Rebuilt after the flood, 2014. Started anew after the fire, 2018. Clara continued. Every month, your grandmother came here to teach, and your grandfather handled the accounts. They used the farm's income and a portion of their investments to fund rebuilding projects. After they passed, I thought the program would fade. But Grace told me, when Ethan is ready, he'll find us. My throat tightened. They never told me, I said quietly. She said you weren't ready to see the weight of it, Clara replied. But now it's yours to carry. She handed me a folder filled with documents, ledgers, plans, donor letters. My grandparents had quietly built an entire foundation on compassion. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a living legacy designed to restore, not hoard. I spent hours walking through the property with Clara. There were cabins for displaced families, a workshop for teaching trades, a community garden that stretched nearly 2 acres. Every corner of that land breathed with the quiet humility my grandparents had lived by. When I finally stood on the porch at sunset, the golden light spilling across the fields, I felt something deep in my chest shift, something heavy lifting. For months, I'd been fighting to keep what I thought was mine. Now I understood. It was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be given. That night, I returned to the estate with a folder under my arm. I sat at my grandmother's desk, opened her old stationery, and began to write. My letter wasn't one of anger or defense. It was an announcement. To the Whitmore Family Trust. The inheritance left by Harold and Grace Whitmore will not be spent in bitterness or guarded in fear. It will continue to build the legacy they started in secret. Effective immediately, I am transferring a significant portion of the estate's assets to the Grace Haven Foundation to expand its reach and continue their mission of rebuilding lives. This is what they intended. This is what it means to be a Whitmore. Ethan. Weeks passed. The lawsuit faded into silence. My parents didn't call again. My mother sent one brief message. We hope you're happy. I didn't reply. Happiness wasn't what this was. It was peace. And peace was enough. The press caught wind of the foundation's expansion months later. And for the first time, the Whitmore name appeared in headlines not for scandal or wealth, but for generosity. Donations poured in. Families were rebuilt. Hope became tangible again. One evening, as I sat on the porch of Grace Haven watching children chase fireflies across the field, Clara joined me. You know, she said, your grandparents used to sit right there every summer night and watch the stars. Grace always said she wanted you to have a place where you could do the same, without noise, without fear, just the sky and the quiet. I smiled faintly. She got her wish. Clara nodded, her eyes glinting in the soft light. She always does. I looked out at the horizon, where the last trace of sun dipped below the hills. The wind carried the faintest sound of laughter and the rustling of leaves, like whispers of approval. For the first time in years, I felt my grandparents close. Not as ghosts, but as guidance. The legacy they left me wasn't the $12 million or the house or the name. It was the courage to use what was meant for greed and turn it into grace. And as the stars came out one by one over Grace Haven, I realized what my grandmother had truly meant in her letter. You are not alone. She had never been talking about fear. She had been talking about purpose. And finally, I understood. 3 years passed before I saw them again. 3 quiet, purposeful years that changed everything I believed about strength, legacy, and forgiveness. The Whitmore estate had become a historical landmark, maintained by volunteers from Grace Haven. What had once been a symbol of isolation now stood as a monument to restoration. Families visited during holidays. Students came to learn about philanthropy and heritage. It was no longer my house, it was everyone's. But time has a strange way of circling back to unfinished chapters. It was late autumn when it happened, the season when the leaves along the driveway turned crimson and gold, when the air smelled faintly of smoke and renewal. I was in the study, reviewing expansion plans for Grace Haven's new literacy wing, when I heard a familiar sound outside, the crunch of tires on gravel. At first, I thought it was one of the volunteers, but when I looked out the window, my breath caught. It was my parents. My father stepped out first, older but still carrying that posture of command, though the edges had dulled. My mother followed slowly, her once polished grace replaced by a frail uncertainty. They didn't look like victors anymore. They looked like people who had outlived their grudges, but not their regrets. I stood at the doorway as they approached. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, not hateful, just old. "Ethan," my mother said finally, her voice soft and fragile. "You look well." "I am," I said simply. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "We saw the news. About Grace Haven. About everything you've done." She tried to smile, but it trembled. "Your grandparents will be proud." My father's jaw tightened. "We didn't come here to talk about the past," he said, though his tone betrayed the weariness underneath. "We came to make things right." I studied him. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in stature but in spirit. The man who once ruled every room he entered now stood on the porch of the house he tried to take, waiting for permission to step inside. "I don't know if right is the word," I said quietly, "but you can come in." They followed me into the study. My mother's eyes moved over the shelves, the paintings, the framed photos of Grace Haven's families. "You've changed everything," she whispered. "It feels lighter here." "That's what happens when you remove the weight of greed," I said, not unkindly. My father winced slightly, but didn't argue. He looked around, his gaze landing on my grandparents' portrait above the fireplace. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said at last. "I came to understand how you did it, how you turned all that bitterness into this." I met his eyes, by remembering who they were, and refusing to become who you became. He flinched but nodded slowly, almost respectfully. "Fair." For the first time in my life, I saw something in him I'd never noticed: humility. It wasn't perfect, and it came too late, but it was real. My mother reached in her purse and pulled out a small wooden box, the one that had been stolen years ago. She set it gently on the desk between us. "We took this," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't about the money, Ethan. I wanted a piece of them. I missed them." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was angry at how they chose you. But I realize now they didn't choose you over us. They chose you to heal what we broke." The words hit harder than I expected. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the sharp edge of resentment when I looked at her. Only sorrow, and something that almost felt like release. I opened the box. Inside was the original letter, perfectly preserved. My grandmother's handwriting still glowed with that soft, certain grace. I read the first line aloud. "Protect your peace." I looked up at them. "You tried to destroy this peace once," I said, "and it cost you everything. But if you're here because you want to rebuild, there's a place that needs hands more than apologies." My mother's brow furrowed. "Grace Haven." I nodded. "We're expanding into 3 new towns. We help families who've lost everything. If you want to make things right, really right, then don't do it here. Do it there." My father exhaled, the faintest smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "Manual labor." I smiled faintly. "You used to say it built character." For the first time in decades, he laughed, a soft, genuine sound. "Maybe it's time I practiced what I preached." We spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in the study, not as enemies or even family, but as people rediscovering the edges of decency. They didn't ask for money, and I didn't offer it. We talked about Grace Haven, about the families rebuilding their lives, and about how maybe redemption wasn't found in wealth or apology, but in contribution. When they left, my father turned back at the door. "You remind me of him," he said quietly. "Your grandfather, the way you think before you speak." I nodded. "I learned that from him, and for what you weren't." He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a strange, wordless peace between us, and then they were gone. That night, I walked through the house in silence. The walls didn't feel haunted anymore. The air was still but warm. I went to the balcony overlooking the fields, where the moonlight turned the grass to silver, and I thought about how strange forgiveness was, how it didn't erase the past, but rewrote its meaning. In that moment, I realized the inheritance hadn't just been money or a foundation. It had been wisdom, passed from generation to generation, through love, through loss, through the quiet power of choice. And though I didn't know what the future would bring, I finally felt certain of one thing. The Whitmore curse had ended, and the Whitmore legacy had begun again. This time, rooted not in blood, but in grace. Time, I've learned, doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. What once burned like open flame eventually becomes light to guide others. It's been 6 years since the day I stood in that courtroom defending not just an inheritance, but my integrity. 6 years since I rebuilt the ruins my family left behind. And now, as I sit beneath the same oak trees that shaded my childhood summers, I can finally say that peace isn't something you find. It's something you create. The Whitmore estate no longer feels like a fortress. It breathes now, alive with people, laughter, and the kind of energy my grandparents always hoped would fill these walls. Every week, families from Gracehaven visit the gardens to learn, work, and heal. The grand halls that once echoed with silence are now classrooms and workshops. The dining hall, where greed once dined now, serves meals cooked by volunteers for people who need them most. Sometimes, when I walk these halls at night, I can almost hear my grandmother's soft hum drifting through the air. I pause by her portrait and whisper, "I kept my promise." Because I did. I protected her peace, and in doing so, I found my own. My parents never returned to live here, but they found something better than comfort. They found redemption. They volunteer at Gracehaven every month now. My father manages logistics, hauling materials, and building homes with his own hands. My mother works with the children, teaching them to paint and read. They don't speak much about the past, and I don't ask them to. We don't need apologies anymore. We have action, and that's worth more than words. One evening last winter, my father stopped by unannounced. He stood on the same porch where, years ago, he had demanded what he believed was rightfully his. Only this time, his hands were open, not clenched. "You know," he said, looking out at the horizon, "your grandparents saw something in you that I didn't." I thought they were wrong. He paused. But they weren't. That was the closest thing to forgiveness either of us would ever need. Now, as I watch the sun set beyond the hills, the light falling softly across the white pillars and golden leaves, I think about how full the circle has become. The boy who once stood in a cold courtroom fighting for survival is now the man overseeing a legacy built not on wealth, but on kindness. Every brick of this place carries their memory. Every act of service carries their blessing. Every smile from someone who finds hope here reminds me that revenge doesn't always come in the form of destruction. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is peace, the kind that humbles those who doubted you and heals those who hurt you. As I walk back toward the study, I pause at the door, running my fingers along the wooden frame. The old grandfather clock chimes softly, steady, peaceful, alive again. I sit at the same desk where my grandparents once wrote letters, pull out a fresh sheet of paper, and write the final entry for the Whitmore Journal. Today, I learned that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you become when the world gives you every reason not to. I close the book, set it on the shelf beside my grandmother's letter, and smile. If this story moved you, or reminded you that real strength often comes from quiet resilience, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories of justice, dignity, and redemption. Drop a comment below. Tell us which moment of Ethan's journey spoke to you the most. We read every one of your messages, and your voices are what keep Revenge Classic alive. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best revenge is peace.